This is part 2 of my associated SC10 4x4 setup video. I'm going to go over what parts I've changed since the last video, what suspension setups I've changed, and a few other notes I would like to point out here since the last video. So the first thing I want to go over is the rear suspension, because this has been a real point of contention, at least for me, and I'm sure many other users have had problems with this car having too much steering and having a high roll center and flipping over. So just to get paint a little better picture of what roll center does, there is no such thing as a perfect roll center setting. It really depends on the track surface you're racing on. And basically, the optimal roll center will optimize a trade-off between stability and lateral grip. So let me explain why. If you have a high roll center, which means that for this camber link here, if you have no spacers on the inside or outside mounting points, then that means that when the car corners, and say there's a lateral load placed on the car, like say if it goes right and the load goes to the left side of the car, if the roll center is high, that means there's going to be more weight placed on the outside tire. So now you have more cornering grip on the outer tire, which is good. But at the same time, if you want to switch directions quickly, the car won't be as stable. Because if you're all the way over in this direction and the car's rolling over in this direction, and then you turn quickly in the other direction, the car will change directions quickly, but the weight will not transfer quickly enough to the other side, to what is now the outside wheel. So now your new outside wheel doesn't have all the weight on it, because the weight hasn't transferred quickly enough, and so it doesn't have as much traction, and so the car is going to start sliding. And then it may, and so because the roll center is high, when the weight finally does transfer over, it's going to hook. Okay? Because it's already started sliding. Now, on the other hand, if the roll center is low, you won't have that problem. You can switch directions very quickly. But then the problem is, as the roll center drops under lateral cornering loads, less weight gets placed on the outside tire, and so you lose lateral grip. So how do you compensate for that? Okay, well, we know that the SC10 4x4 generally has a high roll center, and so we need to keep that low just to make it more stable under cornering. Okay, so you put some spacers under the ball stud that mounts onto the transmission here in the back. I currently have 4 millimeters. One of the other guys that I race with at the track that has one of these put as much as, I think, 8 millimeters under his ball stud. And so the roll center stays low. Okay, great. Now you can change directions quickly. To recover lateral grip, what you can do is take the shocks and put them in a more laid down position. So what that does is when you have suspension travel, the force that acts on that suspension is really a vector. Okay, you'll have some vertical component and you'll have a lateral component. So when the car is cornering, there's a lateral component to the force that acts on the suspension. So if the shocks are more laid down, then that means the lateral component will have a more direct effect on the movement of the shocks and springs, which means that the lateral suspension travel, so to speak, will be effectively softer, while the vertical suspension travel, since you're going from this to this on the shocks, that will have less impact on the springs. And so vertically, the suspension will behave as if it's a little stiffer, laterally behave as if it's a little bit softer. So if you drop the roll center down by adding spacers under the ball stud, you're also going to want to take the shocks and move them inward a little bit, inward on the shock tower and outward on the suspension arms. So this is presently how I'm running it. 4 millimeters lower roll center than stock, and the top of the shocks on the innermost position, the bottom on the outermost position on the arms. That seems to work okay. It's still going to take a little bit more to figure it out. I'm presently running the thinnest anti-roll bar here. I may thicken this up a little bit because the car is still rolling a little too much. So we'll have to see, because if I thicken up the anti-roll bar, that kind of negates the effect of moving the shocks to a more laid down position, because the anti-roll bar is supposed to minimize roll, and moving the shocks like this should help the chassis roll a little more and put more weight on the outside tire. So there's still some optimization I have to do with the anti-roll bar and the suspension settings. Presently, I'm running yellow springs front and rear with low C35 weight oil and the smallest shock pistons front and rear. And it works okay. It's still going to take a little bit more work. So what other things have I done? I have bought, as you can clearly see here, the Exotech LCG chassis. A little bit of dirt. It's very nice. It's about $100 from Stormer Hobbies. I like it. I think it's cool. But to be honest, it's not going to give you $100 worth of extra handling performance. What it does do is it adds about 5 ounces of weight to the chassis down low. So, okay, it does reduce the center of gravity. That's great. Because it's a solid block of metal, it will reduce chassis flex a little bit. So one of the things I noticed when I had the stock chassis in here was that when I braked very heavily going into a corner or accelerated very hard coming out of the corner, the chassis would flex front to rear enough such that the belt would start skipping. Which makes sense because if the chassis flexes a lot, then the belt gets a little loose and it's going to start skipping on the gears. So if you have this on there, it will reduce it somewhat. It won't eliminate it completely, but it will help quite a bit. One of the guys that I race with also has a SC10 4x4. He has the carbon fiber upper brace in addition to the Exotech chassis, and he found that even with those two things combined, there's still some chassis flex because the front screw to his brace snapped in one of the races. So that's probably coming from the fact that the front piece here and the rear piece here are still made out of plastic, and so they may flex enough to give you some, belt skipping here. As for the belt itself, I have found this to be challenging to get it right. Now, maybe that's because this is just my first belt drive chassis, and so I still need to learn a bit more about how to tune it right. But when I had first got this chassis and started racing it, I raced it for quite some time without giving it a whole lot of maintenance. I did tighten the belt pulleys down a little bit because the belt was getting loose. But then over time, the drivetrain was just starting to bind up too much. Actually, one of the bearings that holds in the rear diff got a little grindy, and the belt drive was starting to get it was starting to bind up a lot, and I couldn't make it smooth. And the motor ended up pulling so much current; it was running at 220 degrees. I puffed a few lipos. It was really bad. So I had to go and clean everything out, rebuild it, buy a new belt. I bought some STRC front and rear aluminum pulleys to help smooth things out. Basically, with this belt drive, there doesn't seem to be a very large design space. If you make it too tight, the drivetrain binds up, the motor pulls too much current, and it's bad for the batteries. If you make it too loose, then the belt's going to skip, and so you're not going to apply power to the wheels, and also it reduces the belt life. So this appears to be a small tuning window to really get it to work right. And even with the right belt tension, the drivetrain isn't completely smooth. It's not like taking a four-wheel drive buggy or two-wheel drive buggy and rolling it on the ground with no motor in it. It doesn't roll very freely. It's still kind of not entirely that loose. Let's see, what else did I do? I did buy a bunch of other parts. I installed RPM front and rear suspension arms. I got some more STRC parts, the front caster blocks. Nice red aluminum caster blocks there, you can probably see. You do have to use thread lock to mount these. I did have problems with these screws popping out. These are actually not the stock screws. I already lost those. I had to put thread lock in there, and you may need some thread lock for the ball stud that mounts on top. That will get loose. If you are pretty sure you're not going to change the roll stand at the front, then you can just use thread lock here and lock it in. I also got the STRC front and rear suspension arm hinge pin mount thingies, and these are kind of cool. They do have a little ball cup in there that the hinge pin mounts into. It's supposed to smooth out suspension travel, so now you have a nice, I think it's like a Delrin ball cup into an aluminum contact surface. Should make the suspension travel a little bit smoother. Also have it for the rear. You can probably see it here, this nice red piece. I bought the rear toe blocks, red aluminum. These are half-degree rear hub carriers. You can also, they also make 0-degree hub carriers. I figured I'd get the half-degree ones to make the car a little bit more stable in a straight line. Let's see. So in terms of extra parts, that's pretty much all I did. I am considering getting the Integy front and rear shock towers. They are kind of expensive. They're about $35, $40 each, but they're carbon fiber shock towers with an aluminum mount that should make the shock towers a little more rigid. But presently, I don't see a need to do that. I still want to try to tune this as is. But I'm still working on the suspension, especially for the rear. I took this racing last weekend, and I did okay with it, but the rear was still a little unstable. It still slides a bit, so I have to play around with it more. But I figured I'd at least show you what I've done so far, and if you want to go watch the first setup video and compare it to this, you can see what changes I've made. And that's it for now, I guess. I'll make another one when I feel that, you know, I've made more progress on this setup. Okay.